There is footage that exists somewhere in an archive, a camera running in a room where a conversation was supposed to remain private, a woman sitting across from someone she believed to be a wealthy businessman with the means to help her, and the words that emerge from that exchange are specific, damaging, and entirely documented in a way that nothing she has said before or since has managed to fully undo. The figure mentioned is £500,000 in cash, an offer to open certain doors, a handshake sealed in a private room that would transform Sarah Ferguson's financial story from a private struggle into a public catastrophe with a precise timestamp and a monetary value attached to it. But that moment in 2010, that sting operation caught on hidden camera, was not where this story truly begins. It was instead one particularly visible expression of a pattern that had been running for decades before the camera was activated and would continue in its fundamental character for years afterward. To understand what that sting operation revealed requires understanding the decades that preceded it, requires understanding that this is not simply a story about one bad decision in 2010, but rather a financial narrative that begins in an extraordinarily unlikely place, a royal wedding in Westminster Abbey in July of 1986, and that accumulates across 30 years of choices, of consequences, of rescues and relapses into the exact circumstances that exist in 2026. When Sarah Ferguson stood in Westminster Abbey on that July day in 1986 at the age of 26, she entered one of the most financially complex and most financially peculiar institutional arrangements in the modern world. The royal family's relationship with money operates entirely differently from how ordinary people experience financial obligation. The costs are staggering, truly enormous, and they are absorbed by elaborate systems, by the sovereign grant, by private estates, by the intricate machinery of household management that renders the question of who actually pays for what genuinely opaque, even to the people operating inside those systems. What this produces in someone who enters that world without having been raised within it is a specific and dangerous assumption, a conviction that the price tag is never truly the constraint, that the cost of whatever thing you desire, whatever it might be, will be resolved by mechanisms that operate completely independently of your own resources and your own judgment about what is affordable or appropriate. The spending that characterized Sarah Ferguson's years inside the royal marriage reflected that assumption with absolutely perfect consistency. Contemporary reports from that period describe annual expenditure approaching $900,000, tens of thousands spent on flowers alone, shopping expeditions that could deplete five-figure amounts in the time it takes an ordinary person to complete a week of grocery shopping. Wardrobes accumulated at a pace that no income she was personally generating could possibly have sustained. Staff maintained at numbers that reflected the royal household model, rather than any realistic assessment of what her own actual finances could support. The assumption that ran through every single transaction was identical. The cost is not my problem. The cost belongs to the system. The system will absorb it. And for a considerable while, the system did exactly that. Queen Elizabeth II is reported to have intervened more than once to stabilize the financial situation, including a substantial payment in the mid-1990s when creditors were actively pressing for immediate resolution of outstanding debts. That intervention was significant, not merely in financial terms, but in what it communicated to someone watching and experiencing it, that someone else's money could be deployed to resolve a problem generated by your own choices, that the system would indeed catch you, that whatever the gap between spending and income, a resolution would materialize because that is precisely what had always happened, and therefore what could be expected to continue happening indefinitely. The divorce in 1996 changed the formal structure of the arrangement without changing the expectations that the arrangement had produced. She left the marriage with a settlement that was, by the standards of the world she had been inhabiting, surprisingly modest. Reports suggest a figure around £900,000, a number that sounds substantial until you place it against the annual expenditure of the years preceding the divorce, and realize it represented approximately 1 year of operation at the spending level she had normalized as ordinary. The institutional safety net that had absorbed the costs of that level of operation was suddenly gone, yet the expectation that costs would be absorbed by a system she did not personally fund remained firmly in place. The American reinvention that followed was the mechanism through which that expectation initially found new support and new outlets. She built a commercial presence in the United States that her royal adjacent name made immediately accessible: endorsement deals, television appearances, book deals, the specific kind of celebrity commercial activity that American audiences engaged with far more readily than the British public had been trained to accept. Weight Watchers, publishing ventures, television projects, income was generating. The appearance of a stable second act was real in the sense that money was actually coming in. The difficulty was that the money was coming into a spending environment that had been calibrated to a much higher level than what the commercial income could sustain, and the gap persisted. The debt that had begun accumulating during the marriage continued to accumulate now in a context where the rescue mechanisms were far less automatic and far less reliable. By the late 2000s, the gap had become a genuine crisis. Charitable ventures linked to her name attracted questions about financial governance. Legal disputes emerged over unpaid fees and outstanding obligations. A major business venture collapsed with significant losses. The specific figure that has been cited in various reporting, around £6 million in debt by the mid-2000s, represents not just a large number but the specific endpoint of a process that had been running continuously for decades. Each rescue had resolved the immediate crisis without touching the spending assumptions that generated the next one. Each cycle of debt and recovery left the starting point of the next cycle slightly worse than the previous one, incrementally more desperate, more difficult to reverse. This is the precise context in which Jeffrey Epstein appeared in her life. He did not appear as a stranger, as a random person encountered by chance. He appeared as these arrangements typically work, as someone connected to Andrew, to the social world that Andrew's presence in Sarah's life continued to make accessible, someone positioned within that particular network. Epstein had built his entire network of relationships precisely by being useful to people whose financial situations created specific vulnerabilities, and his kind of usefulness was specifically designed to exploit those vulnerabilities. He offered financial assistance, he offered advice, he offered the specific form of practical relief that chronic financial desperation makes it very difficult to decline regardless of who is offering it. By the time the communications between them began, Epstein had already been convicted. His guilty plea in Florida in 2008 was public knowledge. His registration as a sex offender was public knowledge. The nature of his crimes was established in the public record and had been for months before she reached out to him for financial assistance. That is the detail that makes the subsequent private communications, later released as part of the 2026 Epstein file releases, impossible to explain away or minimize. The urgency of the financial need was real. Rent money required immediately. The landlord threatening to go to the press. The specific and pressured language of someone who has run out of conventional options entirely. That desperation was absolutely real. But the person she turned to with that urgency was someone whose established identity should have made him the absolute last available option, rather than one she reached for. And yet she did. The 2010 sting operation was the public crystallization of a private pattern that had been operating for decades. An undercover reporter posed as a wealthy businessman with money to deploy. The conversation that was recorded, in which he apparently offered to arrange access to Prince Andrew in exchange for £500,000 in cash, was not the conversation of someone who had found themselves in an unusual situation. They did not understand. It was the conversation of someone whose financial desperation had been making increasingly desperate decisions for years, and whose specific form of access, the ability to open certain doors because of her royal adjacent name and her continued proximity to Andrew, was the only remaining commercial asset she possessed that she believed could be converted into the financial relief she needed in that moment. She apologized publicly afterward. She described it as a terrible mistake made in terrible financial circumstances. She said she was in the gutter, a phrase she used about herself that communicated something specific beyond simple embarrassment, an acknowledgement that she understood she had reached a genuine bottom from which the usual mechanisms of recovery might not function. The apology was real, and the self-awareness it reflected was absolutely real. But self-awareness in the pattern that her financial history documents has never been sufficient to produce the behavioral change that would have been necessary to prevent the next iteration of the same crisis from occurring. The years between 2010 and 2026 produced their own version of the cycle, the same pattern expressing itself again. The public apology was followed by renewed commercial activity. The commercial activity generated income without generating the structural adjustment that genuine sustainability actually requires. The spending environment that had been normalized over decades of royal life continued to operate as the baseline against which her income was measured and consistently found insufficient. New ventures launched, some finding modest success, none finding the kind of lasting financial stability that would have allowed the cycle to actually stop or fundamentally break. By 2026, the document releases from the Epstein files transformed the reputational dimension of the entire story entirely. The private communications that had never been intended for public consumption revealed a significant gap between what she had said publicly about her relationship with Epstein, the careful distancing, the expressions of regret, the statements about having severed contact, and what the documentary record of her private messages actually showed. The warmth was evident. The intimacy was evident. The sustained personal connection that continued well past the point where any credible claim of ignorance about his character was available. The language that described him as a supreme friend. the private apology sent to him after the public denunciation, the request for his guidance on how to handle questions about him in a television interview. The institutional response was swift and comprehensive. 7 charitable organizations ended their connections almost simultaneously. Julia's House, the Natasha Allergy Research Foundation, the Teenage Cancer Trust, Prevent Breast Cancer, the British Heart Foundation, a children's literacy charity. Organizations built entirely on public trust that made the calculation quickly and without extended deliberation, that continued association with someone whose private communications so directly contradicted her public account of the same relationship was simply not manageable. The city of York revoked her freedom of the city by unanimous vote. The specific language of the debate was unsparing. They did not expect perfection. They did not want to formally honor someone who had described a convicted sex offender as a supreme friend. The businesses and ventures associated with her name were already contracting when the document releases arrived, but the releases accelerated the process. 6 companies she had directed were dissolved in a compressed window of time in early 2026. The commercial ecosystem that had sustained her across the post-divorce decades was no longer functioning at the same level it once had. The name Ferguson, once a convertible asset in the specific international circles where royal adjacency retained commercial value, now carried the specific associations that the document releases had permanently attached to it, in ways that the network of wealthy friends and Gulf connections that had historically supplemented her formal income could no longer fully offset or neutralize. The Austrian Alps represent the current endpoint of this trajectory. A £2,000 per night wellness resort, reports of spending on credit against the expectation of a deal that will eventually resolve the accumulated debt, the memoir negotiations, the documentary bidding process, the tell-all interview discussions. Each potential opportunity real enough to sustain the confidence that it will materialize. Each of them complicated by the specific circumstances that created the need for them in the first place. The American market where the largest figures are being discussed is also the market where the congressional request for testimony sits unanswered, and where engaging directly with the questions that a major interview would generate carries legal risks that complicate the commercial calculation and limit the options available. The pattern that began in Westminster Abbey in 1986, the assumption that the cost is never the constraint, that the system will absorb it, that the rescue will materialize, has produced the situation that exists in 2026, not because she is without intelligence, or without resilience, or without the specific kind of warmth and charisma that have always been her most genuine qualities, but because those qualities were never paired with the specific behavioral change that would have been necessary to interrupt the pattern before it accumulated, the weight and momentum it has accumulated across 4 decades. The footage from 2010 still exists somewhere. The camera that caught the conversation about £500,000 and open doors in a handshake in a private room. It was the most visible moment in a pattern that was already decades old when it was recorded, and that has continued in its essential character for the 15 years since. The palace doors are locked in ways they were not locked before. The bank accounts are under scrutiny in ways they were not scrutinized before. The documentary record of what was said privately is now part of the public archive in ways that cannot be reversed or unseen. Whether this is the version of the crisis that produces something genuinely different, a reckoning that changes the fundamental relationship to spending and comfort, rather than simply resolving the current instance of overspending, an account of the Epstein relationship that is honest enough to be credible, rather than managed enough to be commercially viable, is the question that the current moment contains. The pattern says it will not happen, that the next rescue will materialize in some form, and the cycle will continue in its essential character for another iteration. Sarah Ferguson has surprised people before. She has built second acts from positions that looked utterly irretrievable. She has found the resilience that people who wrote her off did not credit her with. But the specific form of surprise that this particular moment requires, the fundamental shift in the relationship to money and to comfort, and to the assumption that the cost is never the constraint, is a different kind of surprise from the ones she has produced before. And whether the Austrian chalet, and the credit cards, and the deal that is always just around the corner, are evidence of the familiar pattern continuing, or evidence of a woman preparing for a different chapter entirely, is the question that for now the white cap and the oversized glasses and the visible red hair can only gesture toward. The cost is being calculated. The bill, as it always does eventually, is arriving, and the question of who pays it this time, and whether paying it in whatever form produces something genuinely different from what all the previous payments produced, is the one that the full 40 years of this story has been building toward.